The first time Clara Wynne stepped into the Whitmore estate, the air felt thicker than it should have. Humid Charleston summers were nothing new to her. But this was different. The house seemed to hold its breath, like it knew she didn't belong. She clutched the worn leather strap of her toolbox tighter as the butler, a thin man with a voice like creaking floorboards, led her into the east wing. "The portrait is just through here," he said, glancing at her only once. His tone wasn't unkind, but it was distant, as if he were used to people like her being in the background. Clara had been restoring old paintings for over a decade. She loved the intimacy of it, hours spent alone with oil and dust, uncovering stories trapped beneath centuries of varnish. She liked quiet puzzles, liked people less, but this job was different, not because of the painting itself, an oversized oil of a patriarch from 100 years ago, but because of who had commissioned it. Caroline Whitmore. Clara had known that name her entire life. Growing up, her mother used to work as a housekeeper for the Whitmores. Then, one day, she was gone. No note, no goodbye, no answers. The police said she probably left of her own will. "People do that sometimes," they told young Clara. She never believed it. And now, 24 years later, Caroline Whitmore had reached out to her to restore a piece of family history. Clara said yes before she could think twice. The butler opened a heavy oak door, and Clara stepped into a room that smelled of old wood and turpentine. There it was, the portrait. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, and set in an ornate gold frame that looked like it hadn't been dusted in years. The man in the painting had stern eyes and a jaw like a carving knife. There was something unsettling about him, even rendered in oils. Clara approached it slowly, her eyes narrowing as she examined the cracked surface. Bits of the varnish had yellowed and chipped, and faint outlines of brush strokes peeked from underneath. It wasn't in terrible condition, but something felt off. She set down her kit, put on gloves, and carefully lifted a loupe to her eye. There, just below the collar, was a faint texture that didn't match the original technique. She leaned closer. A signature, but not the artist's. It was faint, like it had been added later, and it was a name she hadn't seen in decades. M. Wynne. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her mother's initial and last name. The coincidence was impossible. She pulled back, suddenly aware of the silence pressing in on her. A distant grandfather clock chimed from another room. Her heart pounded loud enough to drown it out. Was it a mistake? A trick of the light? But she had seen enough hidden inscriptions in her work to know. Someone had etched that name deliberately, carefully, quietly. She didn't know whether to feel terrified or vindicated. "Is everything all right, Miss Wynne?" the butler asked from the doorway. She hadn't even heard him return. "Yes," Clara said quickly, forcing a polite smile. "Just admiring the craftsmanship. It's older than I expected." He nodded and closed the door behind him again. Clara turned back to the painting. The name stared back at her like a ghost. Had her mother painted it? That couldn't be. She wasn't an artist. At least Clara didn't think she was. Or had she left a message? Clara took a deep breath and reached into her kit for a soft brush and a UV light. If there was more to find, she'd uncover it. She'd built her life around peeling back layers, and now, maybe for the first time, it was personal. She leaned in again, this time near the background behind the man's shoulder. She swept the brush gently, clearing decades of grime. Something shimmered faintly under the surface, invisible to the naked eye. Lines. Shapes. Letters? Yes. Just beneath the glaze was a faint scrawl, a different set of initials, C.W. Caroline Whitmore. It looked like a note had been painted over, scrubbed out deliberately. But even a cover-up leaves a trace if you know where to look. Clara's hands shook. The varnish was just the beginning. The painting wasn't just a portrait. It was a palimpsest, layered with secrets, history, and possibly even a confession. She was no longer just a restorer. She was a witness. And for the first time in 24 years, Clara Wynne felt like she was finally getting close to the truth. The next morning, Clara returned to the Whitmore estate with a slight chill in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. The humidity hung in the air like an old curtain. Yet something about the house made her feel colder the closer she got. The grand Georgian columns, the heavy oak doors, the silent windows, all of it exuded an old power, one that didn't like to be questioned. Inside the housekeeper, a woman named June with stiff posture and silent shoes, guided Clara back to the makeshift studio where the portrait waited. The easel stood exactly where she'd left it, bathed in soft natural light from the tall bay windows. Clara unpacked her gloves, brushes, and solvents, moving with methodical ease. But her mind remained fixed on the faint initials she'd seen yesterday, scratched beneath the varnish like a ghost whispering through centuries. MQ. Could it be? She hadn't said the name aloud in years. Meredith Quinn, her mother, had worked here decades ago. Briefly, quietly. Her name had never made it into any family record Clara could find. It was as if she'd been airbrushed out of their history. And maybe now, the portrait was about to put her back in. Clara leaned in, using the cotton swab to gently continue lifting the varnish. The face beneath, a young woman with storm gray eyes and auburn hair, began to emerge more clearly. A Whitmore daughter, perhaps. But something about the tilt of her head, the defiance in her gaze, made Clara pause. This wasn't the bland portrait of some debutante meant to sit quietly in the family's legacy. This was something else. Her phone buzzed. Clara jumped slightly, quickly pulling off one glove to check. A text from her assistant, Lily. Lily, you asked me to check on Meredith Quinn in the estate records. Nothing in the public ones. But I found something in an archived employee ledger from 1986. She worked at Whitmore House for 6 weeks. Then, no mention. Just gone. Gone. Clara's breath caught. She stared at the canvas. 6 weeks, then nothing. The same time this portrait had been commissioned, if the inscription on the frame was accurate. She turned to the back of the painting, running her gloved fingers along the wood. And then, there it was, another small marking, carved faintly into the stretcher bar. Property of W.H. Whitmore House. But why label it that way? Paintings didn't usually carry that kind of mark unless there was something contested. Her pulse quickened. Suddenly, a voice behind her. "You're quite thorough." Clara turned, startled. A tall man stood in the doorway, maybe late 40s, dressed in a gray linen suit that looked effortlessly expensive. His hair was peppered with silver, and his smile was razor sharp. "I'm Miles Whitmore," he said, stepping into the room. "My father commissioned that portrait." Of my Aunt Clara nodded slowly. "It's a remarkable piece." "Yes," Miles said, stepping closer. "My aunt was unconventional. A troublemaker, died young." Clara watched him. His eyes didn't leave the painting. "What kind of trouble?" she asked carefully. Miles chuckled softly. "She fell in love with someone she shouldn't have. That's how these stories always go, isn't it?" Clara's skin prickled. Miles looked at her, really looked at her, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny. "You have her eyes," he said suddenly. Clara froze. "I'm sorry?" she managed. Miles smiled politely, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a resemblance. Nothing more." He left just as quickly as he'd come. Clara waited until the sound of his footsteps faded, then turned back to the painting. She stared at it, and now she saw it differently. The girl in the portrait wasn't just defiant. She was scared, hiding something, holding a secret just beneath her skin, and Clara was going to find it. That night, she brought the frame back to her small studio apartment. It was against protocol, but she needed space to work, and to dig. She carefully unscrewed the canvas from the frame, searching the wood. There, tucked between the folds of old linen backing, was something strange. A tiny slit. She slid a blade along the seam, pried it open gently, and pulled out a single yellowed slip of paper. One line, hastily written in pencil. "If I disappear, tell Clara what they did." The world tilted. Her knees nearly gave out as she sat down hard on the floor. The message was real. They had known, and someone had tried to warn her, decades before she was ready to listen. Now she was listening, and she wouldn't stop until she had every answer. Clara barely slept. The note haunted her like a whisper from the past she never meant to find. "If I disappear, tell Clara what they did." The handwriting was shaky, frantic, as though the writer had only seconds to hide it. But how could it be about her? She hadn't even been born when this portrait was painted, hadn't even existed when Meredith Quinn vanished from the records. And yet, someone had written her name on that scrap of paper, stuffed it into the back of a painting no one was supposed to restore, and buried it inside a gilded lie. The next morning, Clara dressed with more intention. No messy bun, no paint-stained jeans. She pulled on a crisp blouse and dark jeans, a look that said, "I belong here. I know what I'm doing." She needed them to underestimate her less. Back at Whitmore House, June the housekeeper raised an eyebrow at her outfit, but said nothing. Clara nodded politely and asked to speak with Miles. "He's not in today," June said, "but Mr. Whitmore left a message. You're welcome to continue your work." Of course he did. She made her way back to the studio. The portrait, now free of its heavy frame, leaned against the easel like a stripped confession. Clara stared at it, then flipped it around. She rechecked every joint, every fold, but there was nothing else. No more notes, no secret compartments. So who had written the message? Her phone buzzed. Another text from Lily. "Lily, I dug deeper into Meredith. Guess what? She gave birth at St. Mary's Hospital in 1987. Name listed, Clara Quinn. Father unknown." Clara sat down hard. Her breath caught, her world realigned, not shifted, cracked. She had always believed her mother died young, that her father had been a name too painful to speak. But this meant everything she'd believed was a lie. Not just forgotten history, deliberate erasure. She was Meredith's daughter, the girl in the painting, the one with defiance in her eyes, was her mother. And this house had buried them both. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, like it was trying to break free. She stood slowly, looked back at the portrait, and said aloud for the first time, "Hi, Mom." The silence that followed was thick, sacred. She didn't cry, not yet. The tears would come later. For now she had work to do. Clara spent the rest of the afternoon in the Whitmore Library. Miles had left no restrictions, and the housekeeper didn't follow. The shelves were ancient, leather-bound volumes, handwritten ledgers, property records dating back to the 1800s. She found a locked cabinet near the fireplace, but the glass had warped over time, and the latch gave easily under pressure. Inside, letters, dozens of them. She pulled one at random. It was addressed to Francine Whitmore, dated July 3rd, 1986. "You were right to fire her. She stirred things up in ways that made the family uneasy. Miles says she knew too much about the ledger. I burned the copy I had, but you should be careful. The girl wasn't stupid. She knew how to hide things." Clara's hands trembled. She read 3 more letters, all referencing someone unnamed. The girl, the staff member, the one who wouldn't play along. They never used Meredith's name, never gave her identity power. But Clara saw it clearly now. Her mother had discovered something that terrified the family. A financial scandal? A hidden pregnancy? Or something worse? She took photos of everything, carefully placing the letters back where she found them. Then, before leaving, she wrote herself a reminder in her phone. Find the ledger. It wasn't until she stepped outside that she saw the black SUV idling at the edge of the circular driveway. Miles was back. He stood beside the vehicle, arms crossed, watching her. Clara kept her face blank and walked calmly toward him. Productive day? He asked, voice neutral. Very, she said. The portrait's nearly done. Just a few final passes. He nodded slowly. You've been spending time in the library. Clara met his eyes. It's part of the job. Understanding the subject? Of course, he said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just be careful what you stir up. Some things are better left untouched. Clara's jaw tightened. Or buried. Miles stepped closer. Exactly. They held eye contact for a long beat. Then Miles turned, climbed into the SUV, and drove away. Clara stood in the gravel drive for a long time after. Her stomach churned. She knew then that he knew exactly who she was and what she was starting to uncover. She had stepped into something bigger than herself, but she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything they had tried to erase. The rain came in sheets the next morning, not soft and romantic, but sharp, stinging and cold. Clara pulled her coat tighter around her and stared up at the old estate. Whitmore House looked different in the wet light, less regal, more haunted, like it knew she was close to the truth. She'd barely slept again. Instead, she'd stayed up reviewing every photo she took of the letters. There was a pattern forming, subtle but undeniable. Mentions of the ledger, too much power, inheritance disputes, money, secrets, control. And Meredith, her mother, had somehow been caught in the middle. Inside the house, June was nowhere to be seen. Clara took it as a silent blessing. She needed time, privacy. She headed straight for the East Wing, the oldest part of the mansion, and the one Miles had never mentioned. The door creaked open like something out of a horror movie, but the air smelled only of dust and age, not danger. It was colder here, abandoned. No portraits hung on the walls, no fresh paint, just forgotten rooms filled with the ghosts of choices. She passed through an old study, a dressing room, and what must have once been a nursery. And then, tucked behind a crumbling bookcase, she found it. A small room with a desk bolted to the floor. Inside the bottom drawer, a leather-bound book, the ledger. It was older than she'd imagined. The pages yellowed, the handwriting elegant and cruel. And on page 72, dated September 5th, 1986, she found it. Disbursement withheld pending settlement with Quinn. Clara's heart skipped. Below that scribbled, Francois confirms she's pregnant. Threatens exposure. Family votes 4-1 to resolve privately. Ledger updated pending resolution. Resolve privately. No names. Just silence wrapped in ink. They had known. They had tried to bury it. Clara took a deep breath, took photos of every page, and slid the book back into its place. Then she turned around and froze. Miles stood in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, calm, calculating. "You're braver than I thought," he said quietly. Clara didn't move. "I was looking for context." "You found more than that," he replied. "Did you think we wouldn't notice what you were doing?" She swallowed hard. "Why do you care so much about a portrait? About an old staff member?" He stepped inside the room, his shoes echoing against the stone floor. "Because that staff member almost destroyed us. And now her daughter walks in, pretending to be just another restorer? I should have stopped you the second I saw your face." The breath caught in Clara's throat. "So you did know," she said. Miles gave a sad smile. "You look just like her." There was a pause, thick with memory, regret, and something darker. "I'm not here to destroy anything," Clara said. I just want the truth. He tilted his head. The truth is complicated. No, she said. You made it complicated. You silenced her. You buried her. You erased her name from your archives, your ledgers, your family tree. And now you want me to stay quiet too? He stepped closer. If I were you, I'd leave before you end up like her. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. I'm not afraid of you. You should be. Back in her tiny apartment that night, Clara couldn't stop shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from fury, from a lifetime of questions suddenly catching up to her in one terrible, clear picture. Her phone buzzed. Lily. Did you find it? Clara. Yes, and I confronted him. Lily. Jesus. Are you okay? Clara. Not really. But I know what I need to do next. She opened her laptop, created a new folder, uploaded every document, every photo, every recording. She titled it, The Quinn Report. It was time the world remembered Meredith Quinn. The email was short, simple, devastating. Subject, Inquiry. Ms. Wynne, your request for access to the Whitmore archives has been denied. All future correspondence will be redirected to legal counsel. Regards, Eleanor Hemsley, Whitmore Estate. Legal. Clara stared at the screen, lips tight, jaw clenched. She expected resistance, but not this fast, not this calculated. They were trying to shut her down, bury her mother a second time, this time digitally, legally, thoroughly. But Clara wasn't 16 anymore. She wasn't scared. She was furious. She texted at Lily. Clara, they lawyered up. Lily, of course they did, but you already have everything you need. Clara, not everything, there's still the press. Lily, careful, Clara. Clara, careful hasn't worked for 30 years. She met with a reporter at a small cafe on West 12th. James Tolman was younger than she expected. Mid-30s, dressed like someone who'd been thrown out of a newsroom for asking too many questions. Perfect. He glanced at the manila folder she slid across the table. Is this the whole story? No, Clara said. It's just the part I can prove. He flipped through pages, paused. Ledger entries, scanned letters, a missing employee record, and a confrontation with Miles Whitmore? Clara nodded. Recorded, it's on the USB. He looked up. They're going to hate you for this. They already do. He grinned. Then let's burn the whole thing down. The article dropped 3 days later. The Forgotten Heir, what the Whitmore estate tried to erase. Byline, James Tolman, special to the Chronicle. It exploded online. Within hours, Clara's inbox flooded with emails. Some kind, some vicious, anonymous messages, legal threats, interview requests. But most surprising, a name she hadn't heard in years. Subject, Meredith Dear Clara, I knew your mother. We worked together in the summer of '86. She wasn't just a maid. She was brilliant, kind. She had dreams bigger than that house. I have something you need to see. Can we meet? Lorraine lived in a small brownstone in Brooklyn, the kind of place that smelled like old wood and lavender. She was in her 70s now, elegant, worn, holding a memory like it was porcelain. She was scared, Lorraine said, setting down a faded photograph. Meredith stood in front of the Whitmore house, hand on her belly, smiling despite everything. She told me someone in the family made promises, that he'd help her. Then everything changed. They moved her to the guest cottage, told the staff not to speak to her. One night, she just disappeared. Clara swallowed hard. And no one reported it? Lorraine shook her head. Not officially, but we all knew, and we all said nothing. She opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. She gave this to me, in case something ever happened. Inside was a handwritten letter. To my daughter, if they ever let you find this. Clara's hands trembled. She read every word through tears. Her mother had known. She had tried to protect her, even in silence. Clara stood in front of the Whitmore gates one last time. The house loomed behind the iron bars like it had for generations. Proud, indifferent, hollow. She wasn't here for revenge anymore. She was here for reckoning. A woman in a gray blazer stepped forward, the new PR director, face stiff, voice sharp. "You need to leave, Ms. Wynne," Clara smiled, calm, powerful. "I'm not staying," she said, "but they'll be coming, journalists, lawyers, historians. The internet doesn't forget anymore, neither do daughters." The woman flinched. Clara turned and walked away. Not defeated, not afraid, but finally, free. The morning after the confrontation at the Whitmore gates, Clara woke to silence. Not the kind she grew up with, fearful, heavy, stuffed with unspoken grief, but a clear, clean quiet. A pause before the world reshaped itself. On her nightstand, her mother's letter lay unfolded, its creased edges softened from how many times Clara had read it. Meredith's words were etched into her now. Not just her story, but her strength. The world had taken so much from her mother. But Clara had taken something back. The headlines continued to roll. Heiress or housekeeper? The true story of the Whitmore legacy. How one woman exposed a dynasty's darkest secret. Meredith Wynne, the woman history forgot. Journalists dug deeper. Archive photos resurfaced. A quiet investigation into the Whitmore Foundation's finances was suddenly not so quiet anymore, and people were listening. The narrative shifted. Clara Wynne was no longer just a name in the comments. She was a voice. "Do you think she would have wanted all this?" Lily asked, watching Clara sip burnt coffee from the diner's chipped mug. Clara didn't answer right away. She looked out the window at the city moving around her. Loud, indifferent, alive. "I think," she said slowly, "she would have wanted her name to mean something, not just to disappear, not just to be a footnote in someone else's story." Lily nodded. "You did that for her." "No," Clara said. "She did that for me. I just finally listened." The Whitmores issued a public statement 2 weeks later. A bland mix of legal jargon and veiled denial. "We acknowledge past misunderstandings, deep respect for all former staff, ongoing commitment to transparency." But what stood out was the final line. "We will be creating the Meredith Wynne Scholarship Fund to support first-generation college students in New York City." It wasn't justice, but it was acknowledgement. And that was a beginning. Clara stood on the stage of the community center, palms sweating slightly as she looked out at the small but packed room. Students, teachers, journalists, survivors. She cleared her throat, the microphone crackling softly. "I used to think history was fixed," she began, "that the people with the biggest names and the tallest buildings got to decide what mattered. But I was wrong." A pause. "History is memory, and memory belongs to those brave enough to speak." She held up the photograph of Meredith. "This is my mother, and this is her legacy. Not because a rich family finally said her name, but because she lived, fully, fiercely, and with more courage than the people who tried to erase her." Silence. Then, applause, not polite, not rehearsed, raw, earned. Later, alone in the back hallway, Clara leaned against the cool brick wall. She let herself breathe. "Clara?" She turned. It was Lorraine, the woman who had kept her mother's letter safe for 3 decades. Her eyes were glassy, but she smiled. "She'd be proud of you," she said. Clara nodded. "I hope so." "She would," Lorraine whispered. "And she is." They hugged, a long, quiet moment that bridged years of loss, silence, and finally, truth. That night, Clara sat at her desk, the city humming just outside her apartment window. She opened a blank document. The title came easily. "The Story They Tried to Bury." Not for clicks, not for rage, but for all the daughters who'd been silenced. And all the mothers who'd never had the chance to speak. Clara began to write, and for the first time, Her story was hers.